Thank you to all our speakers coming to us today as well. I got to listen, I suppose, to quite a little bit here, and I suppose there are just a few questions for me. It's funny, it was mentioned that this may not be the utmost priority in a lot of minds, in a lot of schools, and for a lot of principals. And for me, the area that I'm in, actually my priority is just building schools, getting space, actually getting space. There's a special needs school in Ballinasloe, literally fighting for additional accommodation, and got a site now to build a new school. Children that are literally don't have space in a classroom, and especially during the lockdown there. There's a school, again, primary school in our area. We are in a DESH, we're in a sort of a deprived area according to Pobble from the most recent census, and still nearly 25, 30 years waiting for a school. That is what we are fighting for. So I understand when it comes to the priorities, and as you've mentioned here about the different priorities that are before principals, teachers and yourselves. I suppose just some of the questions that I wanted to ask, apologies now, I'm just pulling up my doc as well. I mean, we're here to discuss the pre-legislative scrutiny, education, the admission to schools bills, and I know that I've heard just a few of you commenting here in the last few contributions from my colleagues. One of the other priorities, just for me, is the rollout of the DESH identification model so that secondary schools can actually apply to be part of DESH and actually get the extra supports to put in place and to do things like have special needs classes. And again, that has to happen, and there has been money allocated in the budget this year, over 18 million, and that should be happening very, very soon. But it should have happened ages ago. But anyway, if I can pose a question to you. Yeah, there's an oversubscription crisis at the moment. The census is due out this year, that we're going to be doing a census, and there's going to be data coming out of that about maybe the areas of population and where we're going to have demand and so on. When it comes to oversubscription, could I ask your comments on areas of deprivation and how do we encourage and support parents that come from deprived areas to get more involved, be it in boards of management, but also in the application process, and how do we engage with them at an early stage, and whose role is that to engage with parents at an early stage? Sorry, 3 little bits put into one. And then I suppose secondly, there was a bit about involving them in the boards of management, but I suppose just what, would you have any comments on the census that's going to be done this year? And I might pose that question maybe to Mr. Paul Crone and Mr. Pat McKelvey, I suppose, from the ETB, if anyone else has time to come in. And also over the special needs schools as well, please, if you'd like to comment, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I think it's Ms. O'Rourke, is that right?
I suppose, thank you very much. The census data is very, very welcome. And I know in my previous role before I was in APD, I worked in the City of Dublin Education and Training Board and was very involved in looking at school places and school buildings and looking at the planning of the demographic needs of the particular areas. So, and again, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think the anticipated cap in numbers is around 2024 in post-primary. So at that stage, and that may be contradicted in this census, and that's why it will be very, very interesting, because we're in the middle of, I suppose, a teacher supply crisis, a school building crisis, and we need to know, like when we're coming out of COVID, where is the light at the end of the tunnel, and the census will provide that information for us. And we, as I suppose, stakeholders in education, have a responsibility to get involved and to drive that debate, to make sure that schools are supported. And it's very difficult for communities and for parents not to understand why there are delays in that area. And to your second question around engaging parents, and this is a huge concern coming out of the pandemic. The DESH programme has been phenomenally successful. Looking at our international scores in the PISA studies has shown that it has been hugely successful. It's been looked at internationally as being a success. The DESH schools, through the Homeschool Liaison Scheme, have managed to connect parents in with schools. They have actively sought that, and they've done huge work in improving attendance, attainment, retention, transition, all of those. But there's a big fear that during the pandemic, with the remote teaching and schools which were inclusive environments, and it would be a hive of activity till 5, half 5, 6 o'clock until the caretakers lock in the door. By 3:30 now, they're empty under COVID. And there's a huge job of work and a real fear that maybe the work that's been done in DESH over the last 10 years has a chunk of that. We've lost some ground, and it's going to have to be a priority. Now, where we are waiting on the review of DESH.
I may just comment actually, but if I could ask you, Mr. Crone, how do you see, say for yourself and for who you represent, how do you see encouraging engagement by parents, particularly in deprived areas, maybe with low literacy levels, to become more involved? In other words, how do you do that even before primary school, and how do you make sure that they're ready for what's going to happen for their children for secondary school? Would you have any ideas on how that could be done?
We represent the school leaders and principals and deputies at post-primary level, and I genuinely believe that this is a huge concern for principals and deputies, and they actively seek the involvement of the parents, actively get involved with parents' associations, sending their homeschool liaison teacher out, linking in with community groups, and most of the school leaders really engage in the school, is in the community, for the community. It is at times very, very difficult, and it's something that it has to be high on the agenda, and it continues to be high on the agenda. There are elements that we can embrace going forward. For example, the remote parent-teacher meetings tended to have a slightly higher attendance than the face-to-face, sometimes coming out in the cold evenings. And the remote connection is sometimes easier to get a connection with a parent, and that is something that we will be embracing or recommending is embraced going forward.
I suppose as we're using technology and moving forward using technology, like you would hope that for parents, maybe English is not their native language. I mean, how are you going to be using visual supports, and maybe how you're going to be coming in and simplifying your admission procedures? And sorry, Ms. O'Sullivan, sorry, Mr. McKelvey actually to come in if we have time. Sorry, Chair, thank you.
And I think, just to take up your point, Senator, I think that, to take up what my colleague has said, the DESH programme has been hugely beneficial in terms of the schools that it's in terms of, the whole homeschool liaison and bringing people into the building. Very often the kind of people that you're trying to target with that, their experience of coming to school may have been a negative one themselves, or they have no experience of coming to school. So the very act of bringing those people physically into a building can be a huge step for them. I would also like to highlight the fact that, schools become DESH based on, the public percentages, if you like, There are many children also and many families also in non-DESH schools who, suffer equal levels of deprivation, but unfortunately they don't have that access to homeschool liaison, etc. And that can be problematic in itself. I suppose, in our experience, what we would say to is that schools are very proactive in terms of bringing parents in, but bringing them in with purpose. Where it has worked well, you have training programs for parents. Now, some of those are around parenting, some of them are around understanding. So, for example, and you make a really good point, for a parent who mightn't be au fait with education and how it operates, the current enrolment process can be quite daunting. Which pieces do I do? When do I come in? How do I know this? So there is a piece of work to be there. And I think one of the things that we need to be really careful about in this particular space, and our schools are getting better at this in fairness, is rather than the school deciding what they think the parents need, we need to go to those parents and say, what do you need?
So who does that? Okay.
Well,
so say for going to primary school, who engages with the parents when the children are at age 2 or 3? Who does that?
So right now, and I'm being very frank about this, it's probably item number 240 on the principal's list, if you know what I mean by that. In my opinion, I think that we need to have a more system-wide approach in terms of collecting that data, in terms of going to people and asking them. So it's a resources issue really in many schools.
Who does that, Mr. McKelvey? Is it the schools that engage with the parents in their catchment area when they, with all, not their parents, but their children aren't in the school yet? Like, who does that step?
I think it has to be the schools, to be honest.
So the schools engage with those groups prior to the children coming in at primary school level? Okay,
absolutely.
That's great. Thank you so much. And sorry, Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Rourke, if we have time, but I don't know. Okay, sorry. Very quickly, that's okay.
In fact, both gentlemen have said a lot of what I was going to say. I think the issue has been raised around getting the parents on boards of management. To get the parents onto boards of management, to get the parents onto Parents Association or any organisations in a school, you've got to get them into the school first. So it's that whole piece where you may have been very involved in your child's education when they were in primary. Coming to second level, sometimes parents tend to step away. So that is the job of work for our schools, and I think some of our schools do it very successfully, even through the community education programme, using that as a way to bring in the parents. And as Mr. McKelvey pointed out, for a lot of our parents who don't come into school, it's because they've had a negative experience themselves. So it's trying to change that around. So, you know.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry the
I know
time
you're-
is so
yeah.
tight. And Mr. O'Rourke, I might just bring you in as the representative, I know, of the special needs schools, and maybe just if you would have any comment on that to support parents.
Well, I actually, if I could, I wanted to go back to just echo a point that Mr. Edmund made a little while ago. And I think that the census data could be incredibly useful to the special needs sector. And I fully support Mr. Edmund's comment about pre-planning and pre-training in good time before children actually start in school. Because as I mentioned earlier on, the enrolment process and the familiarisation process is lengthy and quite complex, actually, depending on the child's needs. I really welcome his comment that JMB schools are very open to opening special classes. And I'd suggest that those principals or boards of management make contact with CNOs and the NCSE straight away. Because it's our experience in NAMSI that special needs children are travelling sometimes very, very long distances every day on school buses, sharing those buses with children from several other schools. And it sometimes leads to a commute of an hour to an hour and a half each way, which brings us back to the right of a child to access education in their own area, so that they can make friends in their own area and that they're not subjected to these very long commutes. In my experience in a school which had 2 ASD classes, we didn't have to wait until we had a full enrolment before we opened. We opened with 2 children, and I can tell you that very, very quickly we had 2 full classes and waiting lists.
Okay,
So thank you.
thank you very much, Mr. O'Rourke, for that.